The forest lay still beneath the thickening twilight sky, a shadowed world teetering on the edge between night and day. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, but it was a faint whisper that seemed to belong to the coming darkness. The ground was soft with moisture, the damp scent of earth mingling with the crispness of approaching evening. Tall trees stood like silent sentinels, their canopies intertwined, casting deep shadows over the underbrush below. In the distance, the first chirps of the twilight frogs began to punctuate the silence. Their calls were sharp and insistent, a chorus of urgency rising from the murky waters of a hidden swamp deep within the forest. As the night deepened, the croaks and ribbits filled the air, a rhythmic pattern that echoed off the moss-covered trunks. Yet, amidst the chorus, there was something different, something offbeat, a subtle disruption in the otherwise familiar song. The frogs, normally so abundant and free, had started to act strangely. Some paused their calls, while others called too loudly or too faintly. It was as if an invisible tension had woven itself into the atmosphere. Their world, for all its untamed beauty, was not as safe as it once had been. The forest, once so peaceful, now seemed to watch them, silent, ominous. A lone male frog sat near the edge of a small pond, his bright green skin contrasting with the dark water around him. His throat pulsed with each croak, sending ripples across the water's surface. His call was loud, deep. He was trying to make himself known. His movements were deliberate, his position carefully chosen. The female frogs would be drawn to his sound and, perhaps, if he was lucky, she would come. But it was not just the females that were drawn to the sound. Above the pond, nestled in the canopy, a vine snake had heard the calls. The snake was still, its body coiled around a tree branch, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. It had learned over time that the frog's calls were not just for mating. They were a beacon, a promise of easy prey for those who knew how to listen. Tonight, the snake was hungry. The frog croaked again, louder this time. His instincts told him to stay steady, to keep his focus on the sounds of the swamp, to not be distracted by the eerie rustling in the trees. But even the frog's calls seemed different tonight, more insistent, more frantic, like a collective anxiety pulsing through the swamp. A distant rustle in the brush to the left caught the frog's attention, causing his throat to tighten. Something was moving. Too deliberately to be the wind, the frog tensed, his eyes scanning the darkness, but he saw nothing. The murkiness of the night cloaked everything, turning the world into a shadowed labyrinth of sounds and half-formed shapes. The snake's eyes were fixated on the frog below. Its tongue darted in and out, sensing the vibrations in the air, anticipating the next movement, the next croak. With the slightest twitch, the snake began to descend from its perch, its movements silent and calculated. It knew the frogs would not hear it coming, not until it was too late. At the same time, another sound joined the chorus of frogs, one that stood out like a solitary scream in the dark. It was high-pitched, unnatural, and sharp. The frog paused mid-croak, the vibrations in the air altering the perfect rhythm of his call. He froze, his heart beating harder now. Something wasn't right. The croak echoed again, but now it was joined by others, more frantic, more desperate. The frog's muscles tightened as he looked around once more. What was that sound? He had never heard anything like it before. A loud splash broke the air from behind him. He whirled around just as something large and dark broke through the surface of the water. The water rippled violently, and from its depths an enormous shape rose, a water snake larger than any he had ever seen. The vine snake, sensing the disturbance, froze, its eyes narrowing as it watched the newcomer. The water snake slithered out of the water, its slick silvery scales reflecting the faint light of the moon now piercing through the canopy. It had come for the frogs, too. This was no coincidence. The frog didn't hesitate. With a single, powerful push of his legs, he sprang into the air, leaping into the safety of the thickest leaves on a nearby bush. His heart was racing, his limbs shaking with the adrenaline. He could hear the hiss of the vine snake still perched above him, preparing for its strike. But he could also hear the splashing of the water snake, its movements loud and erratic. In that moment, the frog knew something had changed. The swamp, the forest itself, had become a battleground. The chaos seemed to spread as if it were contagious. The frogs, who had once been so confident in their calls, now fell silent. No croaks, no calls to attract mates. Only the sounds of predators hunting, the hiss of the snakes, and the anxious rustling of creatures fleeing into the underbrush. The swamp was alive with fear, and in the midst of it, the male frog's hopes of finding a mate, of continuing his line, seemed distant, almost impossible. He perched motionless, listening to the sounds around him, the sounds of a world that was no longer under his control. The water snake lunged suddenly, and the male frog, in a desperate move, leapt from his perch, narrowly avoiding the strike. He could feel the rush of air as the snake's mouth snapped shut just inches from his hind legs. The water snake recoiled, its body hissing with frustration. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and slithered back into the water, vanishing into the depths. The male frog didn't pause to think. He darted deeper into the underbrush, seeking shelter in the thick foliage, breathing heavily. The chorus of frogs had stopped entirely now, replaced by the rhythmic, distant sound of the water snake's retreat. The forest was silent once again, but the stillness held an unsettling weight. It was then that the male frog realized the full extent of the change that had swept through the swamp. This was no longer just a contest for mates. This was a fight for survival. The frog's calls, once a natural signal of courtship, had become a beacon for predators, drawing danger to them from every direction. And the worst part? The frogs might not have been the only ones who had changed. From somewhere deeper in the shadows of the forest, an even more chilling sound began to rise. A low, guttural hum, one that sent a shiver through the frog's skin. It was not the sound of a snake or a bird of prey. It was something else, something that made even the surrounding trees feel like silent witnesses. The male frog could sense it. The world was closing in. He could hear the hum growing louder, closer, until it was no longer just an echo in the distance, but a living, breathing presence. Something had come to the swamp that had never been there before, something that would alter everything. The hum grew into a tremor, a deep vibration in the air, and the frog's heart began to race again, the fear settling in like a weight on his chest. He had survived the dangers of the snakes, but this new threat was different. He darted further into the darkness, knowing he would never find out what it was. But the forest, the swamp, it would never be the same again. The male frog pressed onward, his small limbs moving frantically through the underbrush, the shadows of the dense forest swallowing him whole. The soft, sticky undergrowth clung to his skin as he hopped over roots and between ferns. His breathing was shallow, his pulse pounding in his throat. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion wearing him down. Something much more primal gnawed at his instinct. That hum, that unnerving vibration in the air, was no longer just a sound. It felt like a force. It felt like something that was alive, and it was coming closer. Every part of the swamp had grown eerily quiet. The crickets, once the relentless percussion to the frog's chorus, had gone still. Even the breeze had stilled, the cool air gone heavy with tension. His skin, normally sensitive to the smallest shifts in his environment, felt a deep, unnatural stillness. Even the faint calls of his fellow frogs, who had been scattered across the swamp, had stopped. The stillness was suffocating. The male frog stopped for a moment, panting, his limbs trembling. His eyes darted around, looking for movement, anything. He didn't want to stop, but his body ached from the sudden sprint, and he needed to assess the situation. In the distance, he saw nothing but shadows and thick brush. But then the Hume returned. This time it was accompanied by a deep rhythmic thumping, a pounding sound like the slow beat of a drum. And then, through the veil of mist rising from the swamp, he saw it. A silhouette, tall and looming, emerging from the shadows between the trees. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. There was no clear shape to it, only a large, undulating form that seemed to shift and flicker in the mist. The Hume was stronger now, vibrating the very air around him. The male frog's heart began to race even faster. He had no time to question what it was. His instincts screamed at him to flee. But he couldn't help himself. His gaze locked on the figure. Something inside him, perhaps a deeper, more ancient part of his being, told him this was not just another predator. This was something worse. Something far more dangerous than the vine or water snakes that had stalked him. The thing moved, slow and deliberate, stepping toward him through the wet grass. It was tall, far too tall for anything that should have been in this swamp. Its form was not solid, but instead seemed to shimmer, as though it were made of liquid darkness, and as it moved, the air seemed to grow cold. The frog froze, his legs locked in place, paralyzed by the deep sense of dread that flooded through him. The pounding grew louder, the thumping was closer now, and with every pulse of sound the creature advanced. It was as though each step it took sent out a wave, warping the very space around it. The swamp was changing. The leaves swirled in unnatural patterns. The mist thickened. And everything within the swamp, everything seemed toward the creature. The male frog was trapped. A sudden piercing screech split the air, breaking the spell of paralysis. Another frog, likely a rival male, darted out from behind a clump of reeds, its green body catching the light from the fading moon above. But before it could even make a leap, the creature raised what could only be described as a tendril of mist, and with a quick, almost casual movement, it struck the frog. The screech died instantly as the body crumpled, the frog's limbs locking up, its body suspended in the air, as though frozen mid-stride. The male frog's mouth went dry, and his heart thudded in his chest, the blood roaring in his ears. He realized now what the thing was. This was not something that belonged to the swamp. This was something otherworldly, something that had crossed into their world, a creature born of nightmares. The creature's tendril lowered the paralyzed frog back to the ground, its body now still and lifeless. A low, guttural sound emitted from its form, like the hum that had first drawn him in. Only this time it carried an unmistakable tone of satisfaction. The male frog took a single step back, his body trembling, but he knew that was a mistake. The creature's attention snapped to him instantly, its dark form swirling toward him, faster now. And then, from the forest beyond, another sound, a chorus of croaks, ragged and strained, began to rise. It was weak, too weak. Something was wrong. The frogs were not calling in their usual rhythm. The calls were broken, desperate, as if they were being cut short. The swamp, his once vibrant home, was falling apart. The male frog hesitated for only a moment before darting into the thick brush, his limbs moving without thinking. He knew he had to escape. He had to find somewhere, anywhere, safe. There was no time to understand what was happening, no time to make sense of the strange, terrifying creature that had appeared. The world around him seemed to warp as he leapt forward. The mist thickened even more, obscuring his vision, and the sound of the pounding grew louder, closer, until it was almost deafening. His legs burned, his heart pounded, and the swamp? His home. seemed to close in on him. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. His legs gave out as he landed heavily in a hidden hole in the earth. Mud and water splashed upward, surrounding him in a thick, suffocating mess. He tried to move but was stuck, his body trapped, half submerged. His breathing quickened as the weight of the mud pressed against his ribs. He didn't dare look up, but he could feel the presence of the creature looming just above him. Its hum resonated, and the thumping of its unnatural steps vibrated through the earth. The male frog could hear the sound of leaves crunching, slow and deliberate, the approach of doom. He could feel it now, the finality of his fate. The hum grew louder, until it seemed to surround him, pressing in from all sides. The air felt thick, heavy with an almost tangible force, and then, without warning, there was silence. Just for a moment. Then, the creature's tendrils moved, wrapping around him with an eerie calmness. The male frog gasped, his limbs locked in place as his world went black. The swamp was no longer just a battlefield for survival. It had become a prison, ruled by something beyond understanding, something that would consume everything within it. And the mating calls of the frogs were no longer a symbol of life. They were a countdown to extinction. The darkness closed in around the male frog as the creature's tendrils wrapped tightly around him, binding his small body in an unyielding grip. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and every breath felt labored, as though the very atmosphere was pressing against him. His mind raced, but his body was frozen in place. It was strange, the sensation of being so close to the end, yet not knowing how it would happen. Would the creature consume him whole, like the snake or the bird would have? Or was there something far worse in store? Whatever it was, the male frog couldn't help but wonder how many others had fallen victim to this mysterious force, how many more would soon join them. But then, just as quickly as the creature had grabbed him, it loosened its hold. The pressure vanished, leaving him in a stunned silence, still suspended in the air. For a brief moment, the frog thought perhaps it had lost interest, perhaps it was waiting to strike again when he least expected it. But then something strange happened. A soft croak, barely audible, broke through the thick stillness. The sound was weak but unmistakable, a female's call. The male frog's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was she still alive? The tendrils that held him loosened further, just enough to give him a flicker of movement. His limbs twitched, and he realized he could move again. Weakly, he pushed against the sticky mud, pulling himself free of the trap that had almost claimed him. His vision was blurry, but he could make out the faint glow of the swamp's ethereal mist, weaving between the trees like threads of silk. He didn't have much time. The croak sounded again, and this time it was clearer. It was coming from deeper in the swamp, from the direction where he had heard the chorus of desperate calls earlier. He didn't understand why or how, but something in him, a deep, primal instinct, told him he couldn't leave her. Without hesitation, the male frog pushed through the thick underbrush, his limbs shaking with exhaustion. His body was sore from the struggle, but he pressed on, driven by the desire to find the source of that faint, fragile croak. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was something deeper still. But the sound called to him. The air around him buzzed with tension as he approached the source. The swamp, once a familiar haven, now felt like a labyrinth of danger. The trees were thicker here, their branches heavy with moss, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally. And then he saw her. She was perched at the edge of a small pond, her eyes wide and glistening with the same fear that had consumed him earlier. But she was also beautiful, a female like no other he had seen. Her skin shimmered faintly under the moonlight, the delicate curve of her throat pulsing gently with each shallow breath she took. She was struggling to remain still, knowing that any movement might attract the attention of the creature that had nearly claimed him. The male frog's heart swelled at the sight of her, and for a moment everything else faded away. The world seemed to stop spinning as he approached her carefully, his every movement calculated and quiet. But before he could reach her, a sharp sound broke through the night. A low hiss. The creature had found them. From the shadows, the creature's dark form emerged once again, the tendrils twisting and writhing in the air. The hum filled the space around them, deep and resonant, and the male frog could feel the vibrations pulsing through his bones. His blood ran cold. But the female frog, sensing the danger, darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the first strike of the creature's tendrils. She leapt with incredible speed, her powerful legs propelling her through the air. The male frog followed instinctively, his instincts kicking into overdrive. Together they ran,